New Wave Community Media.
It's just J-Mike.
Hello, my darlings. Welcome to another episode of Generation Mix, aka GMP, with your host, Jolie. So today's episode is going to be what I now am officially coining reading hour. It's almost like an audible thing because I'm all about bringing out content, whether it's doing my reading hour, doing my Am I the Asshole, having guests on talking about their experience. I'm still going to be pumping stuff out. So if y'all are interested, I'd like y'all to tune into this little reading hour because this special is about 3 more mixed race game changes in history. One's in sports, one's in politics, and one's in music. And their names are Saoul Mamby, May Street Kid, and Charles Mingus. So let's dive on in, baby dolls and baby boys. Saoul Paul Mamby, born June 4th, 1947 to December 19th, 2019. Again, mucho thanks to Wikipedia because this is where all my content comes from. And like I always tell people, if you want to dive further, go for it. This is just the introductory stuff. So he was an American professional boxer who fought between 1969 and 2008. He actually held the WBC super lightweight title from 1980 to 1982. Mamby was born in the South Bronx, New York, to Victoria of Spanish descent and his father, Robert, from Jamaica. He converted to Judaism at age 4 and went to Hebrew school at the Bronx's Mount Horeb synagogue. Mamby became interested in boxing while on vacation in Jamaica. He began his boxing career in 1963 at the age of 16, fighting in the Golden Gloves in 1965 and 1966. He compiled an amateur record of 25-5 before turning pro in 1969. Mamby was a soldier in the U.S. Army and served in Vietnam during the Vietnam War in 1968. So we jump right into the boxing career. So that's a little bit of background intel on him. So he held the WBC super lightweight title once, starting his 2.5-year reign in February 1980 by going to South Korea to stop titleist Kim Sang-hyun in the 14th round. After that, he made 5 successful defenses, traveling to Indonesia and Nigeria in the process. He stopped former WBC lightweight champion Esteban de Jesus in the 13th round in July 1980 on the Holmes Ledoux undercard and decisioned Termite Watkins over 15 on the Holmes Ali undercard. He won a 15-round nod over Joe Kepwani on yet another undercard for a Larry Holmes fight against Leon Spinks. He then went to Indonesia to decision Thomas Americo. So undercards, I believe what those are in fighting, are those are like kind of like, you know, like when you go to a concert and there's the opening act and then you see the actual, you know, group or band or singer. It's kind of like that. It's like the opening act to the big fight. So this is getting this person good publicity and all that stuff. So he's already making a name for himself. In his last bout, leaving the ring as champion, he decisioned Obisia Nwakwa in Nigeria. I'm probably murdering the man's name because I can't speak Nigerian and some last names I struggle with, but I did my best. He was to fight WBA champion Aaron Pryor in the summer of 1982 for a unification bout in the super lightweight division, but instead fought and lost his WBC title by split decision to Leroy Haley in June of that year. He would play the role of world title challenger twice more, once in a rematch with Haley in February 1983, which he lost in a 12-round unanimous decision. He then challenged new champion Billy Costello in November 1984, but lost another 12-round unanimous decision. Other boxers Mamby fought include Robert Durán, with whom he lost by points in a non-title fight in 1976, and Saengsak Muangsurin, to whom he lost in a 15-round decision in Thailand in 1977 in an attempt to win Muangsurin's WBC 140-pound title. Mamby continued to fight well into his 50s, actually, and was forced to retire by the California State Athletic Commission following his last loss in 2000. So if we go all the way back to when he was born, so we're talking about, he was about 53 when they told him, okay, you gotta step down. But wait for it, come back at 60. At the age of 60, Mamby announced a comeback, which was to have taken place in Lapwai, Idaho, at the Peenewas Community Center of the Nez Perce tribe, in a card that was subsequently canceled. Mamby fought several weeks later, weighing 149.5 pounds, and lost a 10-round decision to journeyman fighter Anthony Osborne in the Cayman Islands. As a result, Mamby became one of the oldest boxers to appear in an officially sanctioned bout. It was Mamby's 11th loss in his last 14 fights. Mamby was known for his ability to take punches well. In 85 professional bouts, he was stopped only once, that by an opponent who was several years younger, Darrell Coley, in 1993. Now, that pretty much sums up what I was able to find on Wikipedia. What's interesting in this little thing is we don't know if he was married, if he had any kids, how he passed away. There is a birth date and a death date, but that's pretty much all we have of his boxing career. So maybe there could be some books on him or something like that, but at least you could find him in Wikipedia, and the link will be provided basically in the bio when this drops, y'all. So that's all I got from him. So now, the next powerhouse, I'm going to call him Powerhouses, she has a little bit of a longer history. So her name was Mace Jones Street Kid. She was born February 8, 1904, and passed away on October 20th, 1999. She was an American businesswoman, civic leader, and a skilled politician during a time when both her gender and her interracial background made such accomplishments more difficult than they would be today. She had a distinguished career in public relations, served in the Red Cross during World War II, and was a member of the Kentucky House of Representatives from 1968 to 1984, representing Louisville's 41st State Legislative District. During her tenure in elective office, she was known for her sponsorship of landmark legislation. House Bill number 27, which became law in 1972, created the Kentucky Housing Corporation, KHC, which promotes and finances low-income housing in the state. In 1974, this particular bill was officially designated as the Main Street Kid Act. Representative Kidd also led the campaign for Kentucky to ratify the United States Constitution's 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery, 14th Amendment, defining citizenship, and 15th Amendment, granting all men the right to vote regardless of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Known collectively as the Reconstruction Amendments, all three of these constitutional amendments had become laws shortly after the conclusion of the Civil War, when a sufficient number of lawmakers in other states had ratified them. Representative Kidd offered and secured adoption of a resolution in 1976 to post-ratify the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. So now we're going to dive all the way back to the beginning. Born on February 8, 1904 in Millersburg, Kentucky, to Annabelle Lear, 1883 to 1984, who worked for a well-to-do white family with a large farm in central Kentucky. Kidd's father, Charles Robert Jones, February 6, 1875 to March 15, 1972, was the son of her mother's employers, and she was their second child together. Her older brother was George William Jones, born July 18, 1901, died July 6, 1986. As a girl, she was called Minnie Mae Jones. She attended Springfield Institute from 1948 to 1950, University of Louisville, and American University, 1966 to 67. Kidd spent her early years in Millersburg, a town in Bourbon County. When she was 2, her mother married a tobacco farmer, James W. Willie Taylor, 1881 to 1959, who later became a chicken breeder. Kid's mother, meanwhile, had a thriving catering business and often served as a local midwife. Kid knew that her real father had married and began a family of his own, and they and their mother used to come visit my mother, who was very friendly with his white family, she recalled in an oral history interview with Wade Hall. But I never wanted anything to do with them. I was hurt that he couldn't or wouldn't acknowledge me openly as his daughter. It was a painful part of my childhood, but I got over it. Millersburg's blacks lived in a section of the town called Shipsville, and Kid went to school there until the 8th grade. As a youngster, she realized that her light skin made it possible for her to skirt the Jim Crow laws that were a feature of life in the American South at the time. Under these acts, blacks were restricted to certain schools, seating areas of public transportation, and even drinking fountains and restrooms. She recalled that she liked to go into the Millersburg millinery shops and try on hats as a little girl, and pointed out that all in the town knew that she was of mixed heritage. Kid's mother eventually moved the family to Millersburg proper after asking her cousin, who was white, to purchase the house and have the deed transferred to her. Both Kid's mother and stepfather worked hard to provide a solid home for the children, which included 2 or more of their own. Kid's half-brother, Webster Demetrius Taylor, and half-sister, Mary Evelyn Taylor. As a teenager, Kid wanted to contribute to the household herself, but her mother refused to let her work for white families, telling her, "May, I have to serve other people because I don't have a choice. I want you to have a choice when you grow up." Since her school only went up to the 8th grade, it was decided that she would be sent away to the Lincoln Institute in Simpsonville, created to provide better educational opportunity in the Jim Crow era. She was 15 years old when she left home in 1919 and spent 2 years there before her family's financial circumstances forced her to return home. Kid found a part-time job selling insurance as an independent sales agent for the Mammoth Life and Accident Insurance Company, a thriving Black-owned company based in Louisville. At the time, Black-owned insurance companies were an important part of the African-American economy and some of the largest Black-owned businesses of their era. Like Black-owned banks, they served a community that was often discriminated against by mainstream American institutions. From 1921 to 1925, Kid found a part-time job selling insurance as an independent sales agent for the Mammoth Life and Accident Insurance Company, a thriving Black-owned company based in Louisville. At the time, Black-owned insurance companies were an important part of the African-American economy and some of the largest Black-owned businesses of their era. Like Black-owned banks, they served a community that was often discriminated against by mainstream American institutions. From 1921 to 1925, Kid sold policies for Mammoth and collected premiums. To do so, she walked all over the Black neighborhoods in both Millersburg and nearby city. I never had any bad experiences anywhere because everybody knew my parents in Millersburg, and in Carlisle, I soon became known, and the older people began watching over me, she recalled in an oral history interview, noting that she sometimes collected $100 a day. After 4 years as a salesperson, Kid was offered a job at the Mammoth headquarters in Louisville as a file clerk. She shared an apartment in the Mammoth building with a friend, a young woman whose father was a board member of the insurance company. Kid was thrilled to be supporting herself and living in a relatively large city, which was still a relative rarity for a single woman of any color in 1925. Louisville was still part of the South, however, and it did have unspoken boundaries. I couldn't use the main public library, Kid recalled. I couldn't go to the first-run movie shows on 4th Street. After a time, Kid was promoted to assistant bookkeeper and then moved to the policy issue office. In 1935, she became a supervisor of policy issues, a job she held for 8 years, which entailed reviewing all applications for insurance that arrived at headquarters. By then, Kid had married Horace Street, a top Mammoth executive 13 years her senior. Though much had changed in the years since her girlhood in Kentucky, Kid still trod a fine line because of the color of her skin, even in the 1940s. Her husband refused to let her travel with him when Mammoth business took him to cities farther south, fearing an incident on the train or the refusal to be rented a hotel room, since Kid was often mistaken for white. Street died of heart disease in 1942. Kid joined the American Red Cross in 1943 and was sent to England during World War II. There, she served as an assistant director of a service club for Black American soldiers in Southampton. According to Wade Hill in his biography of Kid, while traveling by train in her Red Cross uniform with her darker-complected brother in his Army uniform during World War II, Kid was asked to move from the colored section of the train to the white section. Kid repeatedly refused and also refused to explain herself, later saying, "I was a grown woman. I was wearing my Red Cross uniform. My brother was a grown man wearing his Army uniform. We were a brother and sister going to see our parents before we shipped overseas. We were both American citizens serving our country. We didn't owe anybody an explanation." After the war, her Red Cross duties in England, Kid had took let me rewind. Let's stop that for a second. Let me try that again. After the end of the war and her Red Cross duties in England, Kid took a job in Portland, Maine, running its United Seamen Service Club, a social gathering spot for merchant seamen. Though she was eager to return to Mammoth, she was uninterested in her former job in the policy office and instead had gained valuable experience in both Maine and England in the relatively new field of public relations. Kid studied on her own and designed a program for Mammoth. She made a proposal before the board, who voted to accept it, and was given her own office and a secretary. As the public relations counselor from 1946 to 1956, Kid supervised all company communications and began a number of programs to create goodwill between policyholders and with the communities the company served. Her plan was so successful that she was hired by the National Negro Insurance Association to create a public relations plan for all of its member companies. In 1948, Kid also organized the first Louisville Urban League Guild and served as president of the Lincoln Foundation. She married an Army officer, American, James Kidd, whom she met while overseas, and moved to Detroit, where he lived. For a time, she worked for a door-to-door cosmetics company, full of projects in both Detroit and Chicago. Kid trained agents and sold the line herself and quit after a time to run a campaign for a candidate running for a seat on the Detroit City Council. It was her first exposure to politics, and she drew heavily upon her public relations experience to help make the campaign a successful one. When Kid did return to Louisville, she was not given her former job as Mammoth's public relation person. Instead, she was forced to return to the ranks of company sales agents. Her boss, she recalled in an interview with Hall, wanted to embarrass me by sending me back to selling ordinary insurance, but I embarrassed him by selling more insurance than anyone in the history of the company. She retired from the company in 1966 at the age of 62. Much had changed since she began with Mammoth in the early 1920s, when it was one of several dozen such insurance companies that served the African-American community. Unfortunately, with integration in the 1950s and 1960s, the white companies began opening up their policies to blacks, and blacks deserted their own companies in droves. It's sad but true that this desertion by blacks of black insurance companies is just part of a larger problem in the black community. We just don't have enough confidence in our own people to patronize each other. 2 years later, at the dawn of a new civil rights era with federal laws barring racial discrimination in all forms, Kid was invited by a number of Louisville Democrats to run for a seat in the House of Representatives in Kentucky General Assembly. She declined several times, but her husband thought it would be a good opportunity for her talents. So Kid agreed and won her first election after campaigning with a carload of neighborhood children who helped her pass out flyers nightly in different sections of her Louisville district. Their youth and energy boosted me when I was exhausted, she recalled. They liked riding in my car and meeting people and being part of an important project. Elected that fall, Kid went to Frankfort and took her seat in Kentucky General's Assembly. She was just one of 3 African Americans in the legislature at the time. The first bill she sponsored prohibited racial discrimination in housing. After several of Kentucky's cities passed their own local open housing legislation in 1966 and 1967, Kid worked with Senator Georgia Davis Powers and Representative Hughes McGill to introduce the Kentucky Fair Housing Act to the Kentucky General Assembly. Kid's bill passed in 1968, making Kentucky the first southern state to enact such laws on its own. In the early 1970s, she sponsored a low-income housing bill that created a state agency to provide low-interest mortgages to first-time homebuyers. Kids struggled for some time to get this bill passed, and only with the election of a new governor in 1972 did she finally succeed in seeing it signed into law. She also sponsored a proposal to make the birthday of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. an official state holiday. In her career in Kentucky's General Assembly, Representative Kidd's first also included being the first female on the Rules Committee. Re-elected until 1984, when she lost after her district was gerrymandered several times, Kidd made civil rights her focus. In the mid-1970s, she learned that Kentucky had voted against the 13th Amendment in 1865 and never ratified the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the U.S. Constitution. Though these abolished slavery and gave U.S. citizenship and the vote to African Americans, it was a symbolic oversight, and Kidd was determined to correct it. She launched a campaign in 1976 to have the amendments officially ratified, and it passed unanimously. It was especially important to me because I am a proud Kentuckian, and I didn't want that blot to remain on our history, she wrote in her memoir. Kidd also introduced a bill to make Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday an official state holiday. For a number of years, Kidd was a frequent presence in civil rights marches and events in her state. She was also known for speaking her mind. Mervyn Osban, associate editor of Louisville Courier Journal, told a reporter for the paper that early in her political career, Kidd never hesitated to call the paper over its political coverage, especially when a reporter's article included quotes from only white males. She would call up and say, "I was there and nobody asked me." She raised holy sin. She figured that people who voted for her needed to know what her position was on a number of issues that came through the legislature. Kidd was active in a number of charitable organizations throughout her life, including the Lincoln Foundation, which helped disadvantaged children at the facility that once schooled her. Toward the end of her life, she lost her eyesight. She died in Louisville on October 20th, 1999. Her biography, based on nearly 40 oral history interviews by Wade Hall, appeared 2 years before her death, and its title, Passing for Black, reflected her mixed heritage and the conflicts she often experienced because of it. Most of us, whether white or black, are mixtures of many races and nationalities, she pointed out. We all have tangled roots. She noted that though times had changed considerably, her childhood was particularly difficult. She likened it to living in a no man's land where I belonged to neither race, because I was neither completely white or completely black. I've been stigmatized and penalized by both races. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, that's NAACP, y'all, presented to her its Unsung Heroine Award at a national NAACP Women's Conference, and she received a Louisville Mayor's Citation for Outstanding Community Service. She also received a Top 10 Outstanding Kentuckians Award and the Humanitarian Service Award from the United Cerebral Palsy Association. Towards the end of her life, she lost her eyesight. She died in Louisville on October 20th, 1999. Her biography, based on nearly 40 oral history interviews by Wade Hall, appeared 2 years before her death, and its title, Passing for Black, reflected her mixed heritage and the conflicts she often experienced because of it. Most of us, whether white or black, are mixtures of many races and nationalities, she pointed out. We all have tangled roots. She noted that though times had changed considerably, her childhood was particularly difficult. She likened it to living in a no man's land where I belonged to neither race, because I was neither completely white nor completely black. I've been stigmatized and penalized by both races. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People presented to her its Unsung Heroine Award at a national NAACP Women's Conference, and she received a Louisville Mayor's Citation for Outstanding Community Service. She also received a Top 10 Outstanding Kentuckians Award and the Humanitarian Service Award from the United Cerebral Palsy Association. So basically, y'all, she was She was quite a powerhouse in her own right. I didn't even know there was a book on her. I'm going to have to read that, Passing for Black. Okay. So now we're going to dive into the last one, my darlings, Charles Mingus. There's actually a documentary of his I tried watching, but I think I need to read about him more to totally get the documentary. And I think this was a really good kind of overview of who he was, because I was trying to get the documentary. I'm like, this is kind of going all over the place. Plus it's jazz, and I'm not very well versed in jazz music, but that's what he was. So Charles Mingus Jr., April 22nd, 1922 to January 5th, 1979, was an American jazz upright bassist, composer, bandleader, pianist, and author. A major proponent of collective improvisation, he is considered to be one of the greatest jazz musicians and composers in history, with a career spanning 3 decades in collaboration with other jazz greats such as Duke Ellington, Charlie Parker, Max Roach, and Eric Dolphy. Mingus's work ranged from advanced bebop and avant-garde jazz with small and mid-sized ensembles to pioneering the post-bop style on seminal recordings like Pithecanthropus Erectus, 1956, and Mingus 1959, and progressive big band experiments such as The Black Saint and The Sinner Lady, 1963. Mingus's compositions continue to be played by contemporary musicians, ranging from repertory bands Mingus Big Band, Mingus Dynasty, and Mingus Orchestra, to the high school students who play the charts and complete the Charles Mingus High School competition. In 1993, the Library of Congress acquired Mingus's collected papers, including scores, sound recordings, correspondence, and photos, and what they described as the most important acquisition of a manuscript collection relating to jazz in the Liberty Library's history. So we go back to his beginning. Charles Mingus was born in Nogales, Arizona. His father, Charles Mingus Sr., was a sergeant in the U.S. Army. Mingus Jr. was largely raised in the Watts area of Los Angeles. Mingus's ethnic background was complex. His ancestry included German-American, African-American, and Native American heritage. His maternal grandfather was a Chinese-British subject from Hong Kong, and his maternal grandmother was an African-American from the southern United States. Mingus was the great-great-great-grandson of his family's founding patriarch, who, by most accounts, was a German immigrant. In Mingus's autobiography, Beneath the Underdog, his mother was described as the daughter of an English-Chinese man and a South American woman, and his father was the son of a black farm worker and a Swedish woman. Charles Mingus Sr. claims to have been raised by his mother and her husband as a white person until he was 14, when his mother revealed to her family that the child's true father was a black slave, after which he had to run away from his family and live on his own. The autobiography does not confirm whether Charles Mingus Sr. or Mingus himself believed the story was true, or whether it was merely an embellished version of the Mingus family's lineage. According to new information used to educate visitors to Mingus Mill and the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, included in signs unveiled May 23, 2023, the father of Mingus Sr. was former slave Daniel Mingus, owned by the family of his mother, Clorinda Mingus, a white woman. When Clorinda married a white man, Mingus Sr. was left with his white grandfather and great-grandparents. His father, who later changed his name to Wes, apparently did not have a relationship with Mingus Sr. His mother allowed only church-related music in their home, but Mingus developed an early love for other music, especially that of Duke Ellington. He studied trombone and later cello, although he was unable to follow the cello professionally because, at the time, it was nearly impossible for a black musician to make a career of classical music, and the cello was not accepted as a jazz instrument. Despite this, Mingus was still attached to the cello. As he studied bass with Red Callender in the 1930s, Callender even commented that the cello was still Mingus's main instrument. In Beneath the Underdog, Mingus states that he did not actually start learning bass until Buddy Collette accepted him into a swing band under the stipulation that he be the band's bass player. Due to a poor education, the young Mingus could not read musical notation quickly enough to join the local youth orchestra. This had a serious impact on his early musical experiences, leaving him feeling ostracized from the classical music world. These early experiences, in addition to his lifelong confrontations with racism, were reflected in his music, which often focused on themes of racism, discrimination, and injustice. Much of the cello technique he learned was applicable to double bass when he took up the instrument in high school. He studied 5 years with Herman Renshagen, a principal bassist of the New York Philharmonic, and compositional techniques with Lloyd Reese. Throughout much of his career, he played a bass made in 1927 by the German maker Ernst Heinrich Roth. Beginning in his teen years, Mingus was writing quite advanced pieces. Many are similar to third stream because they incorporate elements of classical music. A number of them were recorded in 1960 with conductor Gunther Schuller and released as pre-Bird, referring to Charlie Bird Parker. Mingus was one of many musicians whose perspectives on music were altered by Parker into pre- and post-Bird eras. Mingus gained a reputation as a bass prodigy. His first major professional job was playing with former Ellington clarinetist Barney Bigard. He toured with Louis Armstrong in 1943, and by early 1945 was recording in Los Angeles in a band led by Russell Jackett, which also include Teddy Edwards, Maurice James, Simon, Wild Bill Davis, and Chico Hamilton. And in May that year in Hollywood, again with Edwards, in a band led by Howard McGee. He then played with Lionel Hampton's band in the late 1940s. Hampton performed and recorded several Mingus pieces. A popular trio of Mingus, Red Norvo, and Tal Farrow in 1950 and 1951 received considerable acclaim, but Mingus's race caused problems with some club owners and he left the group. Mingus was briefly a member of Ellington's band in 1953 as a substitute for bassist Wendell Marshall. However, Mingus's notorious temper led to his being one of the few musicians personally fired by Ellington, the other two being Bubber Miley and drummer Bobby Durán. After a stage fight between Mingus and Juan Tizol, so I see what they're trying to say. He got into a fight with one of his band members, and then Ellington said, "You know what, deuces, you're out. You're horrible." Also in the early 1950s, before attaining commercial recognition as a band leader, Mingus played gigs with Charlie Parker, whose compositions and improvisations greatly inspired and influenced him. Mingus considered Parker the greatest genius and innovator in jazz history, but he had a love-hate relationship with Parker's legacy. Mingus blamed the Parker mythology for a derivative crop of pretenders to Parker's throne. He was also conflicted and sometimes disgusted by Parker's self-destructive habits and the romanticized lure of drug addiction they offered to other jazz musicians. In response to the many sax players who imitated Parker, Mingus titled the song, "If Charlie Parker Were a Gunslinger, There'd Be a Whole Lot of Dead Copycats," released on Mingus Dynasty as Gunslingin' Bird. Mingus married 4 times. His wives were Jean Gross, Lucille, a.k.a. Celia Germanis, Judy Starkey, and Susan Graham Ungara. In 1952, Mingus co-founded Debut Records with Match Roach so he can conduct his recording career as he saw fit. The name originated from his desire to document unrecorded young musicians. Despite this, the best-known recording the company issued was of the most prominent figures in bebop. On May 15, 1953, Mingus joined Dizzy Gillespie, Parker, Bud Powell, and Roach for a concert at Massey Hall in Toronto, which is the last recorded documentation of Gillespie and Parker playing together. After the event, Mingus chose to overdub his barely audible bass part back in New York. The original version was issued later. The 2 10-inch albums of the Massey Hall concert, one featured the trio of Powell, Mingus, and Roach, were among Debut Records' earliest releases. Mingus may have objected to the way the major record companies treated musicians, but Gillespie once commented that he did not receive any royalties for years and years for his Massey Hall appearance. The records, however, are often regarded as among the finest live jazz recordings. One story has it that Mingus was involved in a notorious incident while playing a 1955 club date billed as a reunion with Parker, Powell, and Roach. Powell, who suffered from alcoholism and mental illness, possibly exacerbated by a severe police beating and electroshock treatments, had to be helped from the stage, unable to play or speak coherently. As Powell's incapacitation became apparent, Parker stood in one spot of the microphone chanting, Bud Powell, as if beseeching Powell's return. Allegedly, Parker continued this incantation for several minutes after Powell's departure, to his own amusement and Mingus's exasperation. Mingus took another microphone and announced to the crowd, "Ladies and gentlemen, please don't associate me with any of this. This is not jazz. These are sick people." This was Parker's last public performance. About a week later, he died after years of substance abuse. One story has it that Mingus was involved in a notorious incident while playing a 1955 club date billed as a reunion with Parker, Powell, and Roach. Powell, who suffered from alcoholism and mental illness, possibly exacerbated by a severe police beating and electroshock treatments, had to be helped from the stage, unable to play or speak coherently. As Powell's incapacitation became apparent, Parker stood in one spot at a microphone chanting, Bud Powell, as if beseeching Powell's return. Allegedly, Parker continued this incantation for several minutes after Powell's departure, to his own amusement and Mingus's exasperation. Mingus took another microphone and announced to the crowd, "Ladies and gentlemen, please don't associate me with any of this. This is not jazz. These are sick people." This was Parker's last public performance. About a week later, he died after years of substance abuse. Mingus often worked with a mid-sized ensemble, around 8 to 10 members, of rotating musicians known as the Jazz Workshop. Mingus broke new ground, constantly demanding that his musicians be able to explore and develop their perceptions on the spot. Those who joined the workshop, or sweatshops as they were colorfully dubbed by the musicians, included Pepper Adams, Jackie Bayard, Booker Irvin, John Handy, Jimmy Nepper, Charles McPherson, and Horace Parlin. Mingus shaped these musicians into a cohesive improvisational machine that was many ways anticipated free jazz. Some musicians dubbed the workshop a university for jazz. Now they're going to talk about his recordings. The 1950s are generally regarded as Mingus's most productive and fertile period. Over a 10-year period, he made 30 records for a number of labels, Atlantic, Candid, Columbia, Impulse, and others. Mingus had already recorded around 10 albums as a band leader, but 1956 was a breakthrough year for him with the release of Pithecanthropus erectus, arguably his first major work as both a band leader and composer. Like Ellington, Mingus wrote songs with specific musicians in mind, and his band for Erectus included adventurous musicians, piano player Mal Waldron, alto saxophonist Jackie McLean, and the Sonny Rollins-influenced tenor of J.R. Monteros. The title song is a 10-minute tone poem depicting the rise of man from his hominid roots to an eventual downfall. That's where the term Pithecanthropus erectus comes from. A section of the piece was free improvisation, free of structure or theme. Another album from this period, The Clown, 1957, also on Atlantic Records, the title track of which features narration by humorist Gene Shepard, was the first to feature drummer Danny Richmond, who remained his preferred drummer until Mingus's death in 1979. The two men formed one of the most impressive and versatile rhythm sections in jazz. Both were accomplished performers, seeking to stretch the boundaries of their music while staying true to its roots. When joined by pianist Jackie Bayard, they were dubbed the Almighty Three. In 1959, Mingus and his Jazz Workshop musicians recorded one of his best-known albums, Mingus Aum. Even in a year of standout masterpieces, including Dave Brubeck's Time Out, Miles Davis's Kinda Blue, John Coltrane's Giant Steps, and Ornette Coleman's The Shape of Jazz to Come, this was a major achievement, featuring such classic Mingus compositions as Goodbye Pork Pie Hat, an elegy to Lester Young, and the vocalist version of Fables of Faubus, a protest against segregationist Arkansas Governor Orville Faubus that features double-time sections. In 2003, The album's legacy was cemented when it was inducted to the National Recording Registry. Also during 1959, Mingus recorded the album Blues and Roots, which was released the following year. Mingus said in his liner notes, "I was born swinging and clapped my hands in church as a little boy, but I've grown up and I like to do things other than just swing. But blues can do more than just swing." Mingus witnessed Ornette Coleman's legendary and controversial 1960 appearances at New York City's Five Spot Jazz Club. He initially expressed rather mixed feelings for Coleman's innovative music. "If the freeform guys could play the same tune twice, then I would say they were playing something. Most of the time, they use their fingers on the saxophone and they don't even know what's going to come out. They're experimenting." That same year, however, Mingus formed a quartet with Richmond trumpeter Ted Curson and multi-instrumentalist Eric Dolphy. This ensemble featured the same instruments as Coleman's quartet and is often regarded as Mingus rising to the challenge new standards established by Coleman. The quartet recorded on both Charles Mingus Presents Charles Mingus and Mingus. The former also features the version of Fables of Faubus with lyrics aptly titled Original Faubus Fables. In 1961, Mingus spent time staying at the house of his mother's sister, Louise, and her husband, Fess Williams, a clarinetist and saxophonist, in Jamaica, Queens. Subsequently, Mingus invited Williams to play at the 1962 Town Hall concert. Only one misstep occurred in this era, the Town Hall concert in October 1962, a live workshop/recording session. With an ambitious program, the event was plagued with troubles from its inception. Mingus's vision, now known as Epitaph, was finally realized by conductor Gunther Schuller in a concert in 1989, a decade after Mingus died. Outside of music, Mingus published a mail-order how-to guide in 1954 called The Charles Mingus Cat-A-Log for Toilet Training Your Cat. The guide explained in detail how to get a cat to use a human toilet. 60 years later, in 2014, the late American character actor Reggie Cathy performed a voice recording of the complete guide for Studio 360. Now we go back to his albums again. In 1963, Mingus released The Black Saint and the Sinner Lady, described as one of the greatest achievements in orchestration by any composer in jazz history. The album was also unique in that Mingus asked his psychotherapist, Dr. Edmund Pollock, to provide notes for the record. Mingus also released Mingus Plays Piano, an unaccompanied album featuring some fully improvised pieces in 1963. In addition, 1963 saw the release of Mingus, 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 an album praised by critic Nat Hentoff. In 1964, Mingus put together one of his best-known groups, a sextet including Danny Richmond, Jackie Bayard, Eric Dolphy, trumpeter Johnny Coles, and tenor saxophonist Clifford Jordan. The group was recorded frequently during its short existence. Mosaic Records has released a 7-CD set, Charles Mingus, The Jazz Workshop Concerts, 1964-65, featuring concerts from Town Hall, Amsterdam, Monterey 64, Monterey 65, and Minneapolis. Coles fell ill and left during a European tour. Dolphy stayed in Europe after the tour ended and died suddenly in Berlin on June 28, 1964. 1964 was also the year that Mingus met his future wife, Sue Graham Ungaro. The couple were married in 1966 by Allen Ginsberg. Facing financial hardship, Mingus was evicted from his New York home in 1966. Mingus's pace slowed somewhat in the 1960s and early 70s. In 1974, after his 1970 sextet with Charles McPherson, Eddie Preston, and Bobby Jones disbanded, he formed a quintet with Richmond, pianist Don Pullen, trumpeter Jack Walrath, and saxophonist George Adams. They recorded two well-received albums, Changings 1 and Changes 2. Mingus also played with Charles McPherson in many of his groups during this time. Cumbia and Jazz Fusion in 1976 sought to blend Colombian music, the cumbia of the title, with more traditional jazz forms. In 1971, Mingus taught for a semester at the University of Buffalo, the State University of New York, as the SLE professor of music, or as we say back home, SUNY Buffalo. In the 1970s, by the mid-1970s actually, Mingus was feeling the effects of motor neuron disease. His once formidable bass technique declined until he could no longer play the instrument. He continued composing, however, and supervised a number of recordings before his death. At the time of his death, he was working with Joni Mitchell on an album eventually titled Mingus, which included lyrics added by Mitchell to his compositions, including Goodbye Pork Pie Hat. The album featured the talents of Wayne Shorter, Herbie Hancock, and another influential bassist and composer, Jaco Pastorius. Mingus died on January 5, 1979, age 56, in Cuernavaca, Mexico, where he had traveled for treatment and convalescence. His ashes were scattered in the Ganges River. Now they're going to talk about his musical style. So, because apparently he was like a huge influence in jazz. So, his compositions retain the hot and soulful feel of hard bop, drawing heavily from black gospel music and blues, while sometimes containing elements of third-stream free jazz and classical music. He once cited Duke Ellington and Church as his main influences. Mingus espoused collective improvisation similar to the old New Orleans jazz parades, paying particular attention to how each band member interacted with the group as a whole. In creating his bands, he looked not only at the skills of the available musicians, but also their personalities. Many musicians passed through his bands and later went on to impressive careers. He recruited talented, sometimes little-known artists, whom he utilized to assemble unconventional instrumental configurations. You're going to delete that part. As a performer, Mingus was a pioneer in double bass technique, widely recognized as one of the instrument's most proficient players. Because of his brilliant writing for mid-sized ensembles and his catering to and emphasizing the strengths of the musicians in his groups, Mingus is often considered the heir of Duke Ellington, for whom he expressed great admiration and collaborated on the record Monkey Jungle. Dizzy Gillespie had once said that Mingus reminded him of a young Duke, citing their shared organizational genius. Now, here comes the personality and tempo. Nearly as well known as his ambitious music was Mingus's often fearsome temperament, which earned him the nickname the Angry Man of Jazz. His refusal to compromise his musical integrity led to many onstage eruptions, exhortations to musicians, and dismissals. Although respected for his musical talents, Mingus was sometimes feared for his occasionally violent onstage temper, which was at times directed at members of his band and other times aimed at the audience. He was physically large, prone to obesity, especially in his later years, and was often intimidating and frightening when expressing anger or displeasure. When confronted with a nightclub audience talking and clinking ice in their glasses while he performed, Mingus stopped his band and loudly chastised the audience, stating, "Isaac Stern doesn't have to put up with this shit." Mingus destroyed a $20,000 bass in response to the audience heckling at the 5 Spot in New York City. Guitarist and singer Jackie Paris was a witness to Mingus's irascibility. Paris recalls his time in the jazz workshop. He chased everybody off the stand except drummer Paul Modian and me. The three of us just walked on the blues for about an hour and a half before he called the other cats back. On October 12, 1962, Mingus punched Jimmy Knepper in the mouth while the two men were working together at Mingus's apartment on a score for his upcoming concert at the Town Hall in New York, and Knepper refused to take on more work. Mingus's blow broke off a crown tooth and its underlying stub. According to Knepper, this ruined his embouchure and resulted in the permanent loss of the top octave of his range on the trombone, a significant handicap for any professional trombonist. The attack temporarily ended their working relationship, and Knepper was unable to perform at the concert. Charged with assault, Mingus appeared in court in January 1963 and was given a suspended sentence. Knepper did again work with Mingus in 1977 and played extensively with the Mingus dynasty formed after Mingus's death in 1979. In addition to bouts of ill temper, Mingus was prone to clinical depression and tended to have brief periods of extreme creative activity intermixed with fairly long stretches of greatly decreased output, such as the 5-year period following the death of Eric Dolphy. In 1966, Mingus was evicted from his apartment at 5 Great Jones Street in New York City for non-payment of rent, captured in the 1968 documentary film Mingus, Charlie Mingus, 1968, directed by Thomas Reichman. The film also features Mingus performing in clubs and in the apartment, firing .410 shotgun indoors, composing at the piano, playing with and taking care of his young daughter Caroline, and discussing love, art, politics, and the music school he had hoped to create. Now here comes his legacy. He has a huge-ass legacy, too. So, first one is the Mingus Big Band. Charles's Mingus music is currently being performed and reinterpreted by the Mingus Big Band, which on October 2008 began playing every Monday at the Jazz Standard in New York City and often tours the rest of the U.S. and Europe. The Mingus Big Band, the Mingus Orchestra, and the Mingus Dynasty Band are managed by Jazz Workshop, Inc., and run by Mingus's widow, Sue Graham Mingus. Elvis Costello has written lyrics for a few Mingus pieces. He had once sung lyrics for one piece, Invisible Lady, backed by the Mingus Big Band on the album Tonight at Noon, 3 or 4 Shades of Love. Epitaph. This is considered one of Charles Mingus's masterpieces. The composition is 4,235 measures long, requires 2 hours to perform, and is one of the longest jazz pieces ever written. Epitaph was only completely discovered by musicologist Andrew Homsey during the cataloging process after Mingus's death. With the help of a grant from the Ford Foundation, the score and instrumental parts were copied, and the piece itself was premiered by a 30-piece orchestra conducted by Gunther Schuller. This concert was produced by Mingus's widow, Sue Graham Mingus, at Alice Tully Hall on June 3, 1989, 10 years after Mingus's death. It was performed again at several concerts in 2007. The performance at Walt Disney Concert Hall is available on NPR. Hal Leonard published the complete score in 2008. Now we're talking about his autobiography. Mingus wrote the sprawling, exaggerated quasi-autobiography Beneath the Underdog, His World as Composed by Mingus, throughout the 1960s, and it was published in 1971. Its stream of consciousness style covered several aspects of his life that had previously been off record. In addition to his musical and intellectual proliferation, Mingus goes into great detail about his perhaps overstated sexual exploits. He claims to have had more than 31 affairs in the course of his life, including 26 prostitutes in one sitting. This does not include any of his 5 wives. He claims to have been married to 2 of them simultaneously. In addition, he asserts that he held a brief career as a pimp. This has never been confirmed. Mingus's autobiography also serves as an insight to his psyche as well as his attitudes about racist society. It includes accounts of abuse at the hands of his father from an early age, being bullied as a child, his removal from a white musicians' union, and grappling with disapproval while married to white women, and other examples of hardship and prejudice. Scholarly influence, oui. The work of Charles Mingus has also received attention in academia. According to Ashton Crowley, the musicianship of Charles Mingus provides a salient example of the power of music to unsettle the dualistic categorical distinction of sacred from profane through otherwise epistemologies. Crowley offers a reading of Mingus that examines the deep imbrication uniting holiness, Pentecostal aesthetic practices, and jazz. Mingus recognized the importance and impact of the midweek gathering of Black folks at the Holiness Pentecostal Church at 79th and Watts in Los Angeles that he would attend with his stepmother or his friend Britt Whitman. Crowley goes on to argue that these visits were the impetus for the song Wednesday Prayer Meeting. Emphasis is placed on the ethical demand of the prayer meeting felt and experienced that, according to Crowley, Mingus's attempts to capture. In many ways, Wednesday night prayer meeting was Mingus's homage to Black sociology. Let me rewind that. let's. Okay, in many ways, Wednesday night prayer meeting was Mingus's homage to black sociality. Interesting word. By exploring Mingus's homage to black Pentecostal aesthetics, Crawley expounds on how Mingus figured out that those holiness Pentecostal gatherings were the constant repetition of the ongoing, deep intent mode of study, a kind of study wherein the aesthetic forms created could not be severed from the intellectual practice because they were one and also but not the same. Gunther Schuller has suggested that Mingus should be ranked among the most important American composers, jazz or otherwise. In 1988, a grant from the National Endowment for the Arts made possible the cataloging of Mingus's compositions, which were then donated to the music division of the New York Public Library for public use. In 1993, the Library of Congress acquired Mingus's collected papers, including scores, sound recordings, correspondence, and photos, and what they described as the most important acquisition of a manuscript collection relating to jazz in the library's history. Cover versions. Tell you this man has a lot of influence. Considering the number of compositions that Charles Mingus wrote, his works have not been recorded as often as comparable jazz composers. The only Mingus tribute albums recorded during his lifetime were baritone saxophonist Pepper Adams' album, Pepper Adams Plays the Compositions of Charles Mingus, in 1963, and Joni Mitchell's album, Mingus, in 1979. Of all of his works, his elegy for Lester Young, Goodbye Pork Pie Hat, from Mingus has probably had the most recordings. The song has been covered by both jazz and non-jazz artists such as Jeff Beck, Andy Summers, Eugene Chadbourne, and Burt Jenks and John Renbourn, with and without Pentagle. Joni Mitchell sang a version with lyrics that she wrote for it. So yeah, these random people just usually basically, not random, but musicians keep using the Goodbye Pork Pie Hat. Elvis Costello, remember him earlier, y'all? Has recorded Ora Dicipitus from Mingus on My Flame Burns Blue, 2006. Better Get It in Your Soul was covered by Davy Graham on his album Folk, Blues, and Beyond. Trumpeter Ron Miles performs a version of Pithecanthropus erectus on his CD Witness. New York Ska Jazz Ensemble has done a cover of Mingus's Haitian Fight song, as have the British folk rock group Pentagle and others. Hal Willner's 1999 tribute album Weird Nightmare, Meditations on Mingus, Columbia Records, contains idiosyncratic renditions of Mingus's works involving numerous popular musicians, including Chuck D, Keith Richards, Henry Rollins, and Dr. John. The Italian band Quintorigo recorded an entire album devoted to Mingus's music titled Play Mingus. Gunther Schuller's edition of Mingus's Epitaph, which premiered at Lincoln Center in 1989, was subsequently released on Columbia Sony Records. One of the most elaborate tributes to Mingus came on September 29, 1969, at a festival honoring him. Duke Ellington performed The Clown, with Ellington reading Gene Shepard's narration. It was long believed that no recording of this performance existed. However, one was discovered and premiered on July 11, 2013, by Dry River Jazz host Trevor Hodgkins for NPR member station KRWG-FM, with re-airings on July 13, 2023 and July 26, 2014. Actually, July 13, 2013. I ran too fast with my mouth there. Mingus's elegy for Duke Ellington's Sound of Love, was recorded by Kevin Mahogany on Double Rainbow, 1993, and Anita Wardell on Why Do You Cry, 1995. So now here goes his awards, y'all. 1971, Guggenheim Fellowship, Music Composition. 1971, inducted into the Downbeat Jazz Hall of Fame. 1988, the National Endowment for the Arts provided grants for a Mingus nonprofit called Let My Children Hear Music, which cataloged all of Mingus's works. The microfilms of these works were given to the music division of the New York Public Library, where they are currently available for study. 1993, like we had, the Library of Congress acquired Mingus's collected papers. how they said it was the most important acquisition. So that was in 93. 1995, the United States Postal Service issued a stamp in his honor. 1997, posthumously awarded the Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award. 1999, album Mingus Dynasty, 1959, inducted into the Grammy Hall of Fame. 2005, inducted at the Jazz at Lincoln Center, Nishuri Egerton Jazz Hall of Fame. And then he has basically filmography. 1959, Mingus contributed most of the music for John Cassavetes' gritty New York City film Shadows. 1961, Mingus appeared as a bassist and actor in the British film All Night Long. 1968, Thomas Reichman directed the documentary Mingus, Charlie Mingus, 1968. 1991, Ray Davies produced a documentary entitled Weird Nightmare. It contains footage of Mingus and interviews with artists making Hal Willner's tribute album of the same name, including Elvis Costello, Charlie Watts, Keith Richards, and Vernon Reid. And this is the documentary I was talking about. It was released in 1998. It's called Charles Mingus, Triumph of the Underdog. It's 78 minutes. It's a documentary film on Charles Mingus directed by Don McGlynn. So I'm going to have to look at that because that is on one of my, I think it's either Hulu or Tubi. I still have it on my list to watch. I watched part of it and I didn't totally understand it. But now that I know about him a little bit, I'll be able to understand the documentary a whole lot better. So, my darlings, thank you for joining me on another deep dive in the history of people that need to be recognized for their contributions in the world and to the world. They each leave behind a legacy that I wanted to share and honor, and so that we know about. So if you like what you heard today on GMP, you can like, rate, subscribe, all the fun stuff. Follow, share, download, send to your friends, family, neighbors, cousins, your mama, your daddy, and your goosey granny. Send it all to everyone so they know about this awesome, awesome podcast, which can be found on Apple, Spotify, iHeart, and Spreaker. And through Spreaker, you can actually get a YouTube audio clip from that, which is really cool. And of course, I am on Instagram, but Generation Mix Podcast. I don't post very much because life is crazy and we're all overworked and underpaid and so on and so forth. And this, my darling, concludes another episode on what it means to be multiracial in America. One story at a time, from the studio to the streets. Ciao!